After the defeat of the Nazis in World War II, Germany was split up amongst the Allies and occupied for the next several decades. However, this division would give rise to a new war, the Cold War, as the Allies in the West watched East Germany become a communist satellite state for the Soviet Union. Here in the good old West, we've all heard tales of oppressed Soviet citizens fleeing communism and risking their lives to escape to our capitalist utopias, and this story will be no different, well, except for the fact that it's about the first mass hijacking event in history. These people were so desperate, they orchestrated a coordinated hijacking of 3 commercial airliners. Nowadays, hijackings have kind of a bad rap, you know, ever since that thing happened.
Osama bin Laden, you can kiss my Royal Irish hand.
But I promise you, everyone can admire this one. Well, unless you're a dirty commie. Our story takes us to communist Czechoslovakia in 1950. Having been occupied by the Nazis during the war, Czechoslovakia was home to a number of fighter pilots who had escaped and joined the British Royal Air Force to fight with the Allies. Interesting tidbit of history, there were several Czechoslovak RAF squadrons. On returning to Czechoslovakia after the war, these pilots found themselves in a bit of a sticky situation. You'd think they'd be regarded as heroes, but by 1948, the Communist Party seized control with the backing of the Soviet Union, and these pilots were now seen as having a proven history of Western ties and sympathies. In the Eastern Bloc, you needed that like you needed a hole in the head. This brings us to our protagonists, Vit Angeter, Ladislav Svetlik, and Oldřich Dolichal, 3 ex-RAF pilots now employed by the Czechoslovakia State Airline. The State Airline employed roughly 130 ex-RAF pilots due to their skill set, but they were seen as politically unreliable and were slowly being replaced by freshly trained pilots who supported communism. Once the ex-RAF pilots were no longer useful, they could expect a visit from the Czechoslovak Secret Police, the STB. Angeter, Svetlik and Dolichal saw this coming and decided to escape before they found themselves out of a job and into a gulag. The fact that the 3 of them were all pilots with the state airline presented them with a unique opportunity, and together they planned their escape. There were a number of immediate problems. Coordinating a hijacking of this scope was going to require a lot more people on board with the plan. Also, the men all had families, who they obviously didn't want to leave behind, but a pilot's family boarding a flight would set off immediate alarm bells. Why? Because these types of hijackings had happened before. In fact, hijackings out of the Eastern Bloc and into the West were a lot more frequent than you might think. Dolichal himself had one of his flights hijacked by an ex-RAF pilot in 1948. You really couldn't make this shit up. After a year of secretive planning, the men were ready. There were 26 involved in the conspiracy, including the men themselves, family, trusted friends, and other pilots and crew. The men met together in a cafe at a Prague airport to finalise the details. That evening, Angeter would be flying to Brno, Svetlik to Ostrava, and Dolichal to Bratislava. The next morning, the return flights were all within hours of each other. And so, on their journey back to Prague, they would each make a break for the nearby Erding US airbase in West Germany. Erding was close enough to Prague that the pilots could fly there without arousing the passengers' suspicions. Dolichal knew this because this was where he had been forced to land on his previous adventure. Some family members would simply board alternate pilots' planes, while some others would attempt to board under their maiden names. Each person would pack no more luggage than was enough for an overnight flight. After all, it'd be a bit strange to bring all your family heirlooms on a 2-day round trip. And so the game was on. The pilots flew to their respective cities, and on the morning of the 24th of March 1950, they each began their flight to freedom. Each pilot flew a Douglas DC-3. Angeter was the co-pilot on the first plane, which left Brno at 6:35 GMT. The captain was a man named Klesnil. Under him, flight engineer Tuchek and radio operator and navigator Mraz. Mraz was in on the plan, along with air hostess Skorpichova. Of the 26 passengers on board, 8 were part of the escape group. Angeter and Mraz would have to take control of the plane from Klesnil and Tuchek, and had smuggled revolvers through airport security. A few minutes after takeoff, Skorpichova entered the cockpit and started a conversation with Klesnil to distract him. Angeter left his seat and locked the cabin door. Tuchek was in his work compartment behind the flight deck, as was Mraz, who drew his gun on him, and the two men bound and gagged him in the storage compartment at the back of the cockpit. Angeter rejoined Klesnil, who was still unaware anything had happened, and took control of the plane. Klesnil, a former RAF pilot himself and a good friend of Angeter's, asked him what the hell he was doing. Angeter told Klesnil his plan. Klesnil himself had secretly been planning his own escape. Sure, look, you might as well, everyone's doing it. The problem was, Klesnil still had family back in Czechoslovakia, so he couldn't take part in the escape. When they landed, he would have to return from Germany and just hope he would get another chance. He would inevitably be questioned about his role in the hijacking, so he was tied up. Air hostess Skorpichova returned to the cabin, where she kept an eye on the passengers, the majority of which were uninvolved in the plan. Among them were the airline's president, a member of the Communist Party who was known to carry a gun. The second aircraft, piloted by Svetlik, left at the same time of 6:35 from Ostrava. His co-pilot was ex-RAF Kozak, flight engineer Holoda, also ex-RAF, and radio operator and navigator Broz. Svetlik's hijacking was anticipated to be the hardest, as he was the only member of the crew taking part. 4 of the 23 passengers were in on the plan, including ex-RAF Popelka, an off-duty pilot for the airline who would be assisting Svetlik. About 30 minutes into the flight, Svetlik put on the autopilot and left his seat, saying he was going to the toilet. Passing through the cabin, he winked at Popelka, which was his signal to enter the cabin. Being a pilot for the airline and a friend of co-pilot Kozak, he was welcome to sit down in Svetlik's seat and chat. Returning to the cabin, Svetlik locked the door and turned off Broz's radio, putting a Luger to his forehead and telling him not to be a hero. Broz was brought to the back. He then prodded Holoda in the back to get his attention, and he too went to the back. Svetlik then repeated the same routine with co-pilot Kozak. Realizing what was happening and the welcoming he would likely receive from the STB when this was all over, Kozak pleaded with Svetlik not to leave him unscathed, so it looked like he had put up a fight to stop the hijacking. Svetlik obliged. The third aircraft left Bratislava at 7 a.m. Dolichal was the pilot. All but one of the crew were ex-RAF and were in on the plan. An air hostess is also partaking, as well as 6 of the 25 passengers. Seeing as there was no one that needed to be removed from the cockpit, this would be the easiest hijacking, if you could even call it that, but not necessarily the easiest escape. Because his plane left later than the others, Dolichal was worried that the first 2 hijackings could have alerted the authorities, especially once they'd broken radio contact. As well as this, the escaping passengers had overpacked their bags, like they had been explicitly told not to do. The heavier load meant Dolichal had to opt for less fuel. Still plenty to reach Prague, but maybe not enough for Erding, even less likely if authorities were made aware mid-flight and he had to fly evasively. Airport security seemed to be particularly interested in Dolichal's flight, checking passports and papers twice before boarding, and taking particular interest in one of the escaping passengers, the mother of a figure skating champion who had fled to the west the month before. But eventually, the plane was permitted to fly. Unfortunately, there was an armed STB man on board. As the plane was taxiing, the radio received an urgent message from the control tower. The aircraft was to return to the airport terminal immediately. The radio operator pretended there was interference on the radio and he couldn't hear. Then they hurried off the runway. Sorry, didn't quite get that. Cheap capitalist radio. Ha! Indeed, comrade. Capitalist engineering, what can you do? Enjoy your flight. Approaching Erding, the first plane contacts the airbase and informs them of the situation, telling the US forces that they are seeking political asylum. The airbase allows them to land. The non-escaping passengers are pretty startled to see where they are, including the airline president, who begins shouting, pulls his gun, and heads for the cockpit. He is disarmed and removed by US MPs. Then the second plane arrives. It lands without incident. The third aircraft landing is followed by an outburst from the STB man on board. MPs inform the passengers of the situation and ask them to calmly leave. The STB agent yells at his comrades not to give up. The plane is still Czechoslovak territory, but outside is filthy capitalist dystopia, and they can remain pure if they just stay on board. They leave. The agent dares the US MPs to try to remove him from the plane. They do. Of the 85 people on the planes, 27 are seeking asylum, including one who wasn't even originally in on the plans. Must have been a fairly easy-going chap. His whole life had just been uprooted unexpectedly, but he just rolls with it. The other 58 do not seek asylum. There may have been some among them who wanted to defect, but simply couldn't leave their families back home. Under normal circumstances, a hijacking would never be welcomed like this, but this was the Cold War. The US accommodated the 27 defectors while deciding what to do with them, and made plans for the rest to be repatriated while they kept them separately on the base. They assigned some personnel to keep an eye on them and used it as an opportunity to gather intelligence about living conditions in communist Czechoslovakia. Their meals in the canteen were plentiful and included some luxury foods like pineapples and bananas, very unusual for people from Czechoslovakia who had seen food shortages. The US personnel overheard the hardline communists of the group telling the rest that this was merely a capitalist ploy designed to trick them into staying in the West. The US soon sends the 58 back to Czechoslovakia, who demand the 27 defectors be extradited for their crimes. They are tried in their absence, and the court sentences the crew members to death and the passengers to 25 years imprisonment. The US refuses to hand them over. The returning Czechoslovaks are all questioned by the STB, the crew members under great scrutiny. Captain Klesnil, co-pilot Kozak and flight engineer Holoda are all fired from Czechoslovakia's state airline. In 1951, Klesnil and his family managed to successfully escape by crossing into West Germany on foot. In a similar border crossing, Holoda and 4 other ex-RAF airmen, along with their families, are betrayed by an informant, captured, tried and imprisoned. And that's our story for today. Truly incredible. These men lived under both Nazi and communist regimes and defied both. That's just like the peak of what you can do as a human. Like when you die, your soul is just stamped with all your achievements, and these guys just have fought Nazis and fought communists on there. Fuck. Mine is just gonna have one stamp that says YouTuber, and that's not really a glowing accomplishment. Definitely in some dodgy fucking company there. But I suppose that all comes down to me. It was my decision to be what I am now. Totally insignificant with the exception of making videos about greater men. But no more of this. No more letting the reins of destiny rest idly. It's time I steered my life in a new direction. Time to be something more. Time to be born again. Goodbye, boys. I've got a plane to hijack. Fuck it anyway.